Hi guys, so in today's video we're going to be taking a look at my Mosin Nagant 9130 sniper rifle with a PE scope, not the usual PU scope that most people think of when you talk about Soviet sniper rifles of the Second World War. So we're mostly going to be talking about the scope. The rifle is the same 9130 rifle, so if you want to find out any information about the actual rifle and the mechanics, take a look at my last video on the Mosin Nagant 9130. Just like my last video, this is a deactivated rifle, which means it's legal to own in the UK without any certification, any firearm certificates or licensing or anything like that. Unfortunately, as I found out sometime after I purchased this, this isn't actually a legitimate wartime rifle and scope. The rifle is a 1942 dated Mosin Nagant 9130, I believe. The scope is a more modern reproduction, essentially. It is what it is. I didn't, it's a life lesson, it's a lesson learned. If something seems a little bit too good to be true, it probably is, and to do your research before you part with, any money for something like this. But it serves as a good example of what the Russians were using, and so let's have a chat about it. So, in 1932, the Russian army decided that it would adopt or use the Mosin Nagant M9130 as its sniper rifle platform, essentially. And this 4-power PE scope was decided upon as the scope to use, essentially. This was going to be their default sniper scope. The scope itself is essentially a copy of a Zeiss scope in use by the German army at the time, that the Soviets had actually come into the designs for and the factory to make in a deal with the German army and the German government. So in the interwar period, because of the Treaty of Versailles, the German army was actually prohibited from using certain training in certain tactics and developing certain weapons such as tanks, etc. And they did a deal with the Soviets. Essentially, if the Soviets would allow them to develop these weapons and practice on their soil, where the Western nations wouldn't necessarily be looking and checking up on the Germans. The Germans in turn would give them technologies and designs, etc. for their military, and one of the things they got was this sort of design for this scope. Now the Soviets eventually realised that this scope was kind of big, kind of heavy. Although it's a good scope, it was big and heavy, a bit difficult to manufacture, it's complex. And they designed their own scope in the PU scope. It's 3.5 power, much simpler, and the Soviets moved over to that, and it became a very effective scope when paired with the accurate Mosin Nagants. And we all know about Vasily Zaitsev and all the famous Soviet snipers. So how were these rifles chosen? Well, essentially, when these were tested at the factory, the ones that were the most accurate would be set aside and paired with a scope that would be serial numbered to the rifle, and then these would be issued out specifically to sniper units as sniper rifles. So what else is different about these rifles to a normal Mosin Nagant 9130? Well, not very much. Like I said, the ones that were the most accurate were chosen at the factory to become sniper rifles, and there were very few modifications made. Obviously a mount was added to accept a scope, as opposed to just having the standard iron sights. As the scopes were mounted above the breech of the weapon, the bolt handle had to be modified and turned down so that the bolt could be opened and worked underneath the bolt, because obviously if this was a straight bolt handle, the scope would impede function. The triggers were not modified, but the triggers were made a little bit nicer for the snipers so that they had a cleaner break and were just a nicer trigger than your standard Mosin Nagant. Other than that, they're essentially the same. So I'm going to grab the camera, and bring it over, and we'll have a little bit more of a detailed look at this rifle and the scope, etc. Okay, so let's take a bit more of a look at the scope and the rifle. So as we can see here, we have markings on the scope in Cyrillic Russian, and the Soviet hammer and sickle. It's dated here 1931, and in this little box as 1934. And that should have been my first clue that this rifle was not 100% legitimate. 31 or 34 dated scope on a 42 dated rifle. Moving further along, we've got a simple focus adjustment. You turn this and it will adjust the focus inside the scope. We have windage and elevation adjustment here and here. Again, these are just simple rotating drums that move the reticle inside the scope. And the front end of the scope. Now what we have here is the early pattern of mounting bracket that is tapped and drilled and then mounted to the top of the receiver. Later versions of the PE and the PEM would be mounted on a mounting system that would be mounted on the side. There would be a cutout and the scope would be mounted to the side of the receiver instead of on top. An interesting thing about the sniper rifles, and about most sniper rifles in fact, that is as the scope is mounted directly over the bore and over the receiver, a stripper clip won't actually feed. There's no way to get the stripper clip into the guides to feed properly, and as such the rounds have to be fed into the gun one by one, essentially. If I hold the rifle up, you can see the charger guides there directly underneath the scope. Like I said, this is one of the slightly better reproductions, and you can see that first of all by the craftsmanship. I think it's a very nice looking scope, but also by the fact that the mount has been serial numbered 6946, which matches the bolt. Obviously that's upside down, but you can see it's 6946. That was one of the things that threw me on first looking at this gun, was that the serial numbers all matched and it seemed to be fairly legitimate. So thanks for watching my video, guys, on the Mosin Nagant M9130 PE sniper rifle. Stay tuned for more videos coming soon. Thanks again, guys.